Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
Today on the program, we are going to talk about one thing. Tim Heaphy's review, which was revealed on Friday, and he will present it publicly tonight at 7 o'clock at a Charlottesville City Council meeting. The City Council meeting is, the City Council of Charlottesville is meeting as we speak to handle the consent agenda, some resolutions, some public comment. They will adjourn for dinner, and then at 7 o'clock tonight they will reconvene for Mr. Heaphy's full presentation regarding his report, which certainly has been the topic on social media here in Charlottesville and has been reported by national and international news outlets throughout the weekend. The findings of his report are particularly damning for the chief of the Charlottesville Police Department, Al Thomas, leaders, captains in the police department, the city council, city management, and the Virginia State Police as well, although we should point out that Tim Heaphy was not hired by Charlottesville to review the performance of state police. He was hired to review the performance of city employees and City Hall. Lloyd Snook is a noted, well-known attorney here in Charlottesville and a former member of the Charlottesville Planning Commission. And Lloyd has been kind enough to join me live in studio to discuss this. Lloyd, thank you so much for coming in on short notice. I really appreciate you being here. I want to start just with your general thoughts and reactions, much of which I've read online already, but get us up to speed with this report, your observations, your takeaways, and help us sort of focus on the key takeaways here about what we should be keeping in mind as we have this conversation about these findings.
Well, I think you need to keep in mind what exactly Tim Heaphy was asked to do and to understand what he wasn't asked to do. He was not asked to write the definitive historical account of everything that happened. He was asked to basically make a report to City Council on the city's performance, city employees' performance. And there are a lot of folks who've been commenting online about, well, why didn't he talk more about the state and the governor and Brian Moran and everybody else? And I haven't talked to Tim about it, but I imagine that his answer is going to be, y'all weren't paying me for that. That wasn't my job. My job was to look at the city performance. So what happened about 10 days after the events of August 12th, Tim, as you know, he's a lawyer practicing with the large Richmond firm of Hunt and Williams, and he's also a former former United States attorney here in Charlottesville, well known as a prosecutor and now doing, white collar criminal defense. And so somebody with a lot of experience in the criminal justice system, and he wrote a letter to the city council saying, I hereby volunteer our firm to do the kind of review of the performance of the city government that you all were talking about. Here I am. And so they worked out a deal, and he agreed. As I recall, it was for like a minimum of $100,000 and potentially up to another $350,000 or something. It's a very, it's a big firm with big rates. And
yeah, I think it was $9.50 an hour.
$5.45.
Okay,
I think they said.
In the wrong business, Lloyd.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking, hey, I'm a chump. I don't need $400,000. I'll do it for $200,000. But so they did this report, and they had 4 or 5 attorneys and a bunch of paralegals, and they had some investigators doing all of this stuff, and they looked through hundreds of hours of video, and I'm sure anybody who has looked into this knows there are probably thousands of hours of video that one could look at if you could just get hold of all of everybody's their phones that they had going and things like that. This has to be the most photographed, most videographed demonstration in the history of the world.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's quite well documented.
Very well documented. And of course, as often happens, anytime you've got 3 different cameras looking at one event, you've got at least 4 different interpretations of what happened. And so there were some basic questions that I felt early on needed to be addressed, many of which were addressed. I mean, there's just some simple things like, how did it happen that 4th Street wound up not being blockaded so that James Fields could drive his car down there and crash into a bunch of people?
And he answered that question.
And kill Heather Heyer.
Yeah.
And he did. And what he said was, because I had walked by there at 10:30 in the morning and had seen that that Market Street was blocked, and 4th Street had a little barricade up. But it wasn't blocked as we've started doing now, where you park a truck all the way across the road. It was just a little sawhorse. And eventually it came out that about 12:15 that day, the police officer, it was actually a school resource officer, a woman named Tammy Shiflett.
An elementary school resource officer.
Elementary school, yeah. And just back after being off for 2 months from elbow surgery, as she saw hordes of angry people coming up Market Street past her position and sort of around her position, she radioed saying, "I don't feel safe here. This is a bad scene." Of course, what she was referring to was you had the alt-right folks marching in the northern lanes, the east, I guess it would be the westbound lanes. You had a whole bunch of Antifa or Black Bloc people in the other lane, and they were marching down the street, yelling at one another, and occasionally going over and tugging at the Confederate flags, and sort of tussling all the way as they made their way down Market Street.
And it was that tussling that led to DeAndre Harris getting in a fight and being beaten in the fight.
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, the chronology seems to be that this group moved past Officer Shiflett, moved up to the parking garage. The fight with DeAndre Harris and Corey Long, and I can't remember, Cruz was the guy who claimed that Corey Long hit him or something. Anyway, all of that happened, and around that time, as people kept coming, Officer Shiflett said, "I don't feel safe here," and called into the headquarters, and the command center. Apparently, Wendy Lewis, who was the captain, said to some of the other officers who had been at the parking garage, "Go down and basically reinforce Shiflett's position." And as they did so, somehow or another, it appears to have been in a conversation not part of radio traffic. She wound up taking her car away from that intersection and essentially leaving the position there. And one of the interesting little things here, and I've been following the Facebook traffic on this, is that it's clear that the Charlottesville Police Department has, there are 2 camps, at least 2 camps anyway, and they've all got their supporters on social media. And there's one group out there that seems determined to pillory Wendy Lewis. She's just, a captain, one of the senior in the department, but they've got a whole list of things they think she did wrong. And I went back, and I don't know Wendy Lewis particularly. I know I've met her, but I don't claim any friendship with her or anything. Went back and looked at some of the things that they were saying. I think that's not Wendy's fault. Things like, if you really follow it back, it's not. Other people seem determined to blame Gary Pleasance, Major, for everything.
Who's already announced his retirement, or at least it's known publicly that he's retiring. Yeah.
And so the department seems to be divided. They're not unified, certainly, and I've heard people describing a toxic work environment there in terms of people concerning somebody's going to be stabbing me in the back, somebody's going to be criticizing me to somebody who is then going to fire me.
And that's noted in the Heaphy Report throughout. Yeah. He says, hey, in our conversations and interviews with these police officers, they made it very clear that they were afraid that they would be retaliated against for any information they shared, and that the powers that be in the department, whether it was the chief or somebody else, would be out to get them. And
it's also, just to be fair, it's also, I think, noted that there is a concern that some of the officers had that the social media folks were going to go after them. and that they would become political football. So it was partly that going on in the department, partly a fear that there's scapegoating. I mean, the one thing that's been clear in the last 4 months since this all happened is that scapegoating is running rampant.
Yeah. So the takeaways from the report, I think the most immediate thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's what most jumped out at me was, number one, the word that I've been using online is the incompetence of the chief in both planning and the execution of poor planning for certainly August 12th, but we should say Heaphy's review includes August 11th, includes July 8th, it includes May 13th and 14th. So it's not just August 12th. That, and number two, the evidence that the chief directly interfered in the review process. And one might say, and I don't think it's being hyperbolic to say, that he was intentionally trying to manipulate that process, so that it wouldn't impact him negatively.
Well, and I think we always have to qualify all of this by saying if what is reported in the report is true, because in the last couple of hours, again, my Facebook posts have been blowing up with people telling me, just as an example, Captain Vic Mitchell, who was one of the senior leaders, writing a letter to City Council and others saying, here are the things that I think are unfair about this report, inaccurate, whatever. And one little point that I think that he makes, which people who are listening here, and if you're listening to the news over the next 24 to 48 hours, you may wonder what's going on. He refers to, we thought this was going to be confidential, that we didn't think that we were going to end up with our reports being public, with our comments being public and identified as being public. And he distinguishes between different categories of investigations that might get done. The point that he makes is we were told we had to cooperate. And under the law, if you are told if you're a police officer, you're told it's a condition of your job, you have to cooperate and you have to give a statement. Your statement isn't supposed to be able to be used against you in court, for example, because at that point it's compelled by the government. And so they may have perceived that there was some greater degree of confidentiality coming out of all of this than certainly was evident in the report itself.
Yeah.
At the same time, of course, folks on the left are complaining they didn't participate in the process because they were not confident that their confidentiality would be respected, that if they identified, for example, who some of these people were, that some of their friends might get arrested. And so they were feeling, for a number of reasons, like they didn't want to cooperate. So one of the things that gets a little bit hard to sort out in these not quite formal, not quite informal investigations is, first of all, there's to some extent some self-selection goes on into who decides to talk to them. So you get a somewhat biased sample of information. You get some people who think they've got a greater degree of confidentiality than others, some people who fear that they don't have confidentiality, so maybe they pull their punches and shade things a little bit. And one of the things one of the reasons, I guess, that I would caution people, although I think Heaphy and his folks did a very, very thorough job of documenting what they were documenting, this is not the same thing as what you would get if you had a full criminal investigation.
Because this wasn't a criminal investigation.
It was not a criminal investigation. Yeah. And in some ways it might give you more information because more people would talk. In some ways it might give you less information because you couldn't compel people to talk.
Does there need to be a criminal investigation?
I don't know that there does. Part of what has to happen in a case like this, I mean, you have to think about what's the purpose of the report. The purpose of this report should be seen as, number one, to allow City Council to get enough information for City Council to decide what City Council wants to do going forward, whether that means firing somebody, whether that means bringing in management consultants, whether that means rewriting statutes or personnel procedures. It's one of the things that was disclosed, for example, was that they were concerned that there wasn't enough money in the training budget to get people thoroughly trained for what was about to happen. After July 8th, they realized most of their people didn't have riot gear. They couldn't have sent them out to deal with a demonstration. They had no helmets. But then they got the helmets, and then
they borrowed them from the county. Yeah.
Well, in some cases they borrowed. In other cases they actually bought some. But then when on August 12th they said, "Oh, gee, we should. It's time for us to suit up. Let's go get our helmets." The helmets were 100 yards away. Number one. Number two, they'd never been tried on before. They didn't know whether they fit or not. And one of the comments at one point was one of the senior officers saying, if we were going to be thoroughly trained for all of this stuff, there wasn't enough money in the budget for this. Well, why not? Maybe there needs to be more money in the budget for that. And then that's the kind of thing that a city council needs to know about. So there are a lot of things that city council needs to know that maybe the rest of the world doesn't care about. And there are many things that the rest of the world may care deeply about that city council as an institution doesn't really need to know.
Lloyd, the headlines from New York, D.C., London, reporters covering the release of this report on Friday, essentially captured the most damning aspects of the report, which found fault with the Charlottesville Police Department, notably the chief, but not only the chief, for a really terrible lack of planning for August 12th and poor execution of a poor plan. And that when things started going sideways, it's like there was no response. They were just, for lack of a better word, leaderless. What's your read on that?
Well,
on that aspect of the report?
It was hard for me to figure out, reading the report, what I really thought the Charlottesville, the police department senior leadership was doing to plan. The one thing that was clear was that during the month of July, after July 8th, within the week or so thereafter, city government was very concerned about August 12th, what was going to happen. Was it going to be more violent? There were already more reports that there was talk on the alt-right chat rooms and so on about this is going to be Berkeley all over again and this kind of thing. And so they began to get very concerned about it, but I don't know. And the report doesn't really detail, kind of on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, how the planning was moving forward. What was clear was that the planning was changing, and it was changing almost daily. At one point, one of the lieutenants says to, I think it was Jim Mooney, says to Vic Mitchell, what's the plan or something like that? And Mitchell says it's changing daily. So I'm not sure who was changing what, but they were obviously getting more input, or at least trying to get more input from the state police. One of the other things that was really distressing about the report was the extent to which the state police and Charlottesville didn't seem actually to be communicating. That they would occasionally have meetings together, and they came away with no resolution, or they would, of course, here's one place where we are somewhat hamstrung by the fact that the state police and the state government in general has not cooperated much with Charlottesville in making this investigation. It's hard to know, it's hard to cross-check, it's hard to fact-check what the city PD people are saying about their lack of cooperation, the lack of communication with the state. So we don't know. One of the reasons why it would be really nice if we could get that level of cooperation from the state is, if nothing else, to be able to fact check what our people are saying.
But Heaphy says in his report that the state police was not forthcoming with requested documents.
Right, they were not forthcoming with requested documents. One report that they were told, well, we might have that by April of 2019. Get back to us then. Things like that it seems pretty clear that the state, when I read the state's initial response, they're the first draft of the report they had, and they've got another report, I think, or maybe a final draft or a semi-final draft anyway, that's coming out soon. But I looked at that report and thought, okay, this is clearly the state saying, not mine.
Yeah, this is your problem.
This is all yours. I was.
That sounds like a you problem.
I wasn't even there.
Right.
This kind of thing. It wasn't even the dog ate my homework. I didn't even have a dog.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of CYA activity going on. A lot of people trying to protect themselves,
which is to be expected, right?
It's to be expected. That's right. And so one of the questions that I'm sure Heaphy had to answer was, do I have enough information right now to make the calls that I'm making? And what he says a couple of places is, I didn't get the information that I wanted from the state, from the governor's office. The governor, I think, cooperated, but nobody else up there would. Brian Moran in particular, anybody under his authority basically didn't cooperate. Did I get enough cooperation to have a sense of what happened? And again, recognizing that his major focus is on what was happening in City Hall, he concluded, I got a good enough feel that I could go ahead and make this report. That's not to say I am confident. I'm confident Tim would say, hey, if they opened their files to me, I would be delighted. I could be a lot more certain about
could
a lot
amend
of
this
things.
review, with more information,
and probably could have done this in a whole lot less time. That's one of the other things about these kinds of investigations is they're very time consuming, and one of the ways that you can kind of control how the investigation goes is if you're going to have to release it eventually, just don't release it quickly.
Yeah.
So anyway,
what do you make? As long as we're talking about the Virginia State Police, what do you make of the fact that Heaphy said in his report, we found no evidence of a stand down order? And again, we're just talking about the state police here, which we should remind listeners, Heaphy was not hired to review the performance of the state police. He was hired specifically to review the performance of city employees, period. But he did write about the performance of the state police. That is in there. And he says we found no evidence of a stand down order for August 12th. But in the same report, he says we know for a fact that Virginia State Police officers were instructed to stay behind the barricades and not intervene.
Well, and there was...
And I guess I should say, there's plenty of people online saying, if that's not a stand-down order, what is?
Well, and there's something even better than that. There was one person, a woman who was a lieutenant with the state police, let's see if I can remember her name, who basically, in one of these meetings, she ends up saying to them something that would certainly sound like it could be a stand-down order. It would be... I wish I could find the language. In essence, what she's saying is, we're not going out there, and we're not, you're not going to get us.
We're not going to go out and get in the middle of that.
Yeah, and so and this was something that a number of Charlottesville PD people noted, and they kind of looked at each other and said, "What's she saying?" And
like, why are you coming to Charlottesville on August 12th if you're not planning to help us keep the peace?
Right. And so there is at least something there that suggests that there was, from the state police, again, what is the stand-down order? I don't know. But... No. Get up on that. Oh, okay.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Just want to make sure everybody can hear you.
Yeah. Did anybody give an order that said literally stand down? No. But they were given orders that they should not go insert themselves into harm's way,
right.
Or that they should only do so under certain circumstances, and those circumstances would be, if you can do so sort of discreetly and take down one or two people at a time, and you're doing it safely, and you're not surrounded by a crowd of people.
Yeah.
The catch, of course, the places where those kinds of attacks were occurring were places that were away from Emancipation Park. For example, up by Market Street.
Which is where the state police were.
Right. The state police were at Emancipation Park. Now, one of the other things that's a little bit puzzling out of all of this is I've been trying to figure out, and I may just have not read Heaphy's report sufficiently, with enough attention to this detail, is the question of who the officers were who were actually on Market Street. Yeah, actually in what's called Zone 5. What had happened was, and this is another area of some confusion with the state police, going up to August 4th, the Charlottesville police had organized things around the notion of 4 separate zones, and they would have different officers stationed in each of the zones on basically each one of the sides of the park. And then at some point on August 7th, they decided they needed to add a 5th zone, and they sent that report down to the state police. But the state police never apparently incorporated the notion of this 5th zone into their planning. So they come up with a 4-zone plan, and the city's already set up a 5-zone plan. And so you've sort of initially got some confusion, and the state didn't know what was going on with this 5th zone. Well, the 5th zone was, or what's called Zone 5, is the area that was originally thought of as including Market Street and the Wells Fargo Bank parking lot. And one of the things that the state police...
Which is right
said,
across from the park.
Right across from the park. And more importantly, Wells Fargo, in like the 7th floor of the building, is where they had their command center. I think from there they could look out on what was going on, but they also had video screens and all kinds of other things to keep them informed. And so they thought, okay, we've got to protect our command center. And so they erected a series of barricades around the command center and around the parking lot that had the effect of barricading all of the police officers into, behind the barricades in this Zone 5, so that effectively there was no police officer in the area of Market Street, in Market Street itself. And
which is where all the skirmishes were taking place initially, yeah.
And you had officers on the north side who were basically saying, that's not my zone. They weren't intervening. And the officers on the south side were kind of removed
behind the barricade, saying, well, that's not really my zone either.
Right. And so
So you have this no man's land on Market Street where everybody was fighting.
That's right.
And the takeaway is the police didn't have a plan to really keep the peace in that street specifically is what we're talking about, but,
And whatever the plan might have looked like on August 7th, when it was last revised, it got changed that morning by conditions on the ground in a way that nobody kind of thought through.
Yeah.
And so...
And regarding the Virginia State Police, we should also point out that it's in the report that they offered that day, as much as they told their officers stay behind the barricades, there is evidence that they told the chief of police of Charlottesville, hey, if you need our guys to help you with these intersections, we'll do it.
Right.
We will take Virginia State Police officers from behind the barricades where we told them to stay. We will send them out into the streets at the intersections.
Go to 4th and Market.
On your command.
Right.
We will help you cover these intersections that you've got animal patrol officers covering intersections. You obviously are having a little trouble here. We will help you. That is a fact. And the chief of police of Charlottesville said, no.
We want you there at Emancipation Park.
Stay in the park.
Right. And if you look at all of the outside perimeter locations, for example, we talked earlier about Tammy Schiffler, who's the school resource officer, who was stationed at Market and 4th Street, a crucial intersection. Because that's how you get down.
Even more crucial as it
turned out.
Yeah, as it turned out.
The officer who was blocking Jefferson Street at 4th and Jefferson, Roger Henry, nice guy, school resource officer. That's not his job.
Right.
I suspect he hasn't been trained for any of this.
And they said in the report there was no real training for this.
The officer at, I guess it was 2nd and High, which is right by the back parking lot of the Methodist Church, Lisa Heeshen, isn't even, she isn't even a sworn officer. She's a civilian forensic tech. And she had a police car sitting there, astride the street, but she had no arrest authority. She had no equipment. When a fight broke out 30 yards away or 20 yards away, she couldn't respond. She couldn't get into the middle of that. What she did do was she got on her radio and called for help, not realizing that the state police officers who were 30, 40, 50 yards away couldn't hear her because their radios weren't synced. So she was putting out a call for help to people who couldn't hear her.
We're talking with Charlottesville attorney Lloyd Snook about the Heaphy Report, which was released just a few days ago, and he will be making a presentation of this report tonight at 7 o'clock to the Charlottesville City Council. Lloyd, I wanted to ask you about this one line in the report regarding Chief Al Thomas of the Charlottesville Police Department. It says, and I'm quoting, Chief Thomas acknowledged that the document was designed to be used in advance of these events, though he denied any intention to suggest that it had been used in advance of these events.
Okay, we need to set the stage a little bit
Please.
here. Okay, there is a document that appeared after the events that was intended as, here's a checklist of how to get ready for one of these events. 3 pages, however many, check, do all of these things. And so the report appeared in part of the after reporting of all of this, and it had been prepared without a date on it. And there are those who believe that Chief Thomas was trying to suggest that this document had in fact been used for their planning purposes, but it wasn't. And Chief Thomas ultimately acknowledged that it wasn't used for their planning purposes.
But one gets the impression that he would have liked people to believe it was.
Right. And
Exactly.
So one of the things that happened, and this also came out today when Captain Mitchell sent his letter to City Council and others, he's talking about this, saying, I didn't think he was asking us to backdate the document, although one of his colleagues and one of the other captains thought he was being asked to backdate it. And we said, I wouldn't do that, and that's why there is no date on it. And apparently the document went to the city attorney's office, and the city attorney's office tried to clarify, and eventually did clarify, that the document did not exist at the time of August 12th.
Yeah.
It should have. It should have been followed. It should have been your checklist for how to get ready.
But it was prepared after the fact. And a high school kid could see what was going on to give the impression that they were preparing more than they actually were.
Right. And
Lord knows they wished, I'm sure we should point this out, every single member of that department, we can assume, wishes that there was more preparation. Now, looking back.
I'm sure that's the case. And I think that they would say, we were working hard. We were spending a lot of hours. I can't tell whether they were spending their time efficiently. Certainly that's not really within the scope of what Tim's reporting on. And I can only assume that if that there were a lot of things that complicated their planning, only one of which was not even being sure that this was going to take place in Emancipation Park. And one of the things that was kind of, I'm sure, messing things up for them was that from about July 15th until about August 8th or 9th, there was this debate going on in City Hall of, do we try to either cancel it or move it? I talked to one of the city attorneys who was doing some research, and because maybe she was responding to something that I had written on Facebook or my website or something, where I was talking about how KKK rallies get responded to and some of the things that have been able to be done. For example, searching for weapons, this kind of thing. And one of the questions, a very specific question she asked me was whether I had found any cases that talked about the kind of evidence that a police department could use in court to say, this is why we did this. Could you use hearsay? Could you use prior incidents that involved other people other than, obviously, Jason Kessler himself had not been a part of any of these fights in Portland and Berkeley and other places, but could they use the facts of the fights in Portland and Berkeley and other places as further reason why they needed to lock things down more? So they were focused on the right questions in the middle of July. I can't help but wonder whether the police were sitting there saying, we don't know where we're going to be. We don't know whether whether we're planning for 200 people or 5,000 people. They just didn't know what they were planning for, and we do know there was a mention in there the plans were changing daily, and
Heaphy takes counsel to task on that and says you made it harder for this department to plan because right up until the last minute, you're trying to move it. So they don't even know where the event is going to be. So how can they plan for it?
Until 9 o'clock Friday night, at which time other things are going on in town,
Clearly,
by the way.
Yes. And I want to ask you about that.
At 9 o'clock at night, 8:30, the opinion comes down, and the judge says, no, you've got to leave it where it is. And then they all sit there and say, well, okay, I guess we're back to the last plan that we had.
Yeah.
But for the prior couple of days, I'm sure that they had at least a significant portion of their department spending time. Oh, I know actually what they said was, it was very easy to do a plan for McIntyre Park because there was room. You had 2 baseball fields. You could put the alt-right on one baseball field, and you can put the lefty folks on the other baseball field, and you've got separation, and you don't have to deal with all of these detailed, how do we get them in through a hostile crowd, all the rest of that stuff. That was fairly easy. But I'm sure it was not easy within the department to try to figure out, what are we actually planning for? The other thing that comes through, and you have to kind of look a little bit to follow it, but there are a lot of different opportunities in there where city council gets implicitly criticized for meddling where they ought not to be meddling by basically saying, y'all keep talking about moving this, but just either do it. If you're going to move it, move it. If you're going to cancel it, cancel it. But here we are, and you're sort of getting in the way of everything we're doing. And I would
without really making a decision.
Without making a decision.
Hey, welcome to Charlottesville City Council.
That's right, and they're just dithering. And council is just dithering, and how's the police department supposed to deal with that?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that, as I look at all of this, and I know from conversations with people in City Hall and other places, that there was a lot of indecision. And nobody was willing to say. I mean, they were trying to get the best possible legal answer for a whole lot of reasons, and I commend them for their efforts. But they wound up spending $30,000 with David Boy's firm, for example, to give them an opinion that basically said, "Not sure you can move it." Without. I mean, heck,
So what do you make of I'm not going to ask you to make sense of the postmodern identity politics of the left, but. Which, I certainly banged my head against the wall a few times trying to figure that out. However, and I put this on Facebook today, I'm really fascinated by the extent to which the same people who accuse the Charlottesville Police Department of being white supremacists, of being incompetent, of working for the Nazis, of not doing their job on August 12th, the same people are now running cover and defending the Charlottesville Police Department based on the findings of the Heaphy Report. And one can only assume it's because the chief is a black man. And they don't want to see this sole African-American chief of police thrown under the bus and take the fall for everything that went wrong on August 12th.
And a lot of that is certainly going on. And, my Facebook page is getting the same kinds of comments, and people are accusing me of, covering up for some white guy or another. I'm not, they say, there you are, covering up for the white guy, I guess. What white guy am I covering up for? I've not had an answer to that, but apparently I'm covering up for a white guy.
It's quote unquote the white guy. It's
guy.
Whitey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, the person who was saying this to me was a white person also. But anyway.
But we should point out, I mean, we laugh at one point, but we also have to acknowledge that this is a very real dynamic going on right now in the city of Charlottesville.
Right.
It's like the left these liberals are frozen. They don't really know how to react to it. And one wonders if it would be a different reaction if the chief of police was a white man. Or if they would be saying there is such damning evidence in this report of pure incompetence, and not only incompetence, but direct action to interfere with this review. Allegations of deleting tweets and messing with possible evidence that would impact the findings of the review, that, he needs to resign right now. But what we're hearing from the left is, well, race matters. And we have to take that into account that he's a black man. So we don't want to see him resign.
And all I can say is that's not my call, and I'm glad.
Amen.
And I don't mean to be flip about it, but it is difficult. I've been involved in city politics now, partisan and bipartisan or nonpartisan, in a long time. And this is about as poisonous an environment as I've seen. Where, basically you don't know who your friends are, and who your friends are changes from day to day or minute to minute.
Yeah.
And
wild stuff.
In ways that I have a hard time kind of figuring out. I thought folks were my friends, and they call me every name in the book. And then I say something else that they agree with, and now all of a sudden I'm a hero again. And I don't know. Like I say, I've been glad that I have not been. Well, let me put it this way: Monday nights, I am not at city council meetings. I am at oratorio practice, getting ready for the Christmas concert.
And a very happy man.
And so for the last 17 years that I've been singing in the Oratorio Society, I have not been going to city council meetings. I haven't been watching city council meetings, except during the summer. And so I've been happy to be out of that. But what I've seen is, and it's mainly folks, most folks nationwide would describe me as being a liberal to leftist to progressive. I'm not sure exactly what adjective you want to use these days. But I'm kind of back to where I was when I was an undergraduate at Stanford, where I was the relative conservative out of the bunch. And it's kind of disorienting because I'm getting told, just what
what a Nazi you are.
A Nazi, a preserver of the status quo.
Well,
whatever.
I mean, and we should point out, the beliefs of both sides of this aisle that we live in, they're being radicalized. And we see it, whether it's the alt-right or Antifa, and I'm not drawing moral equivalency here. I'm not doing the Trumpian sin of moral equivalency. I'm just saying that the right and the left are both being radicalized. And that the left is growing louder and louder. And I'm concerned, even more outspoken against the ideals that we like to say we believe in. I mean, Antifa is no friend of democracy. They don't like democracy.
Right.
They don't like free speech. They see these as tools of white supremacy. But at the same time, the alt-right doesn't like democracy either, because they say it's not strong enough of a tool for white supremacy. So you've got all these other Americans in the middle saying, well, wait a minute, I still believe in democracy.
And I've been actually thinking a fair amount about this. I'm giving a talk down in Richmond tomorrow on exactly this point of the question of what does the First Amendment look like after Charlottesville? And do we still have any degree of adherence to the principle of, the core value of the First Amendment is content neutrality, that you don't say we favor the right side, we favor the left side. The problem is that there are now people out there who take the position, as you mentioned before, that the First Amendment is a residue of white supremacy because it doesn't enable or doesn't sufficiently make it easier or whatever for blacks or Jews or pick your group to stamp out hateful speech.
And it makes it easier for hateful speech to be heard in the marketplace of ideas, in the public forum.
And that by allowing the marketplace of ideas to be unfettered and allowing that kind of very hateful speech to come out, that we are furthering the interests of white supremacy, furthering the interests of white nationalists, however you want to designate the group. And of course the basic notion of the marketplace of ideas, going back in First Amendment theory to John Stuart Mill and even before that James Madison, was that the cure for ugly speech is good speech.
More speech.
Is more speech. It is not less speech. And for a long time, I had a sort of, back when you used to have a screensaver because your screen would get burned in.
Right.
I had scrolling across my computer a phrase, a quote from Judge Learned Hand that said, "The spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure it is right." And that, to me, has always been a crucial piece of the First Amendment. What we thought was right 200 years ago included race discrimination and slavery and hateful and terrible violence, and now, of course, it's flipped. What we thought in 1919, with the big problem was the Red Scares and communists under every bed, and nowadays we're more worried about the Nazis than we are about the communists. So it changes, and it gets back to now I really established myself as a fascist. Quoting Barry Goldwater,
you're a very brave man.
the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. It wasn't original with him either, but
right.
The point is that the cure under the First Amendment, the cure under our democracy, is that we have to be vigilant and we have to contest against and we have to speak against hateful speech,
right,
and not just to.
But the cure for the left appears to be to suppress speech.
Well, and that's right.
And that's alive and well on many college campuses, and I'm happy to say not so much at UVA, much more aggressive. We're seeing that at other college campuses around the country, but UVA could be tomorrow for all we know. We don't know that.
And one of the points that I've tried to make when I've talked about the First Amendment is that most of the best First Amendment cases, certainly in my lifetime, grew out of the civil rights struggle. Most of the times, I mean, this is liberals trying to speak, liberals trying to be heard, liberals trying to have protest marches. And all of the great cases are liberal cases.
The success of civil rights, by and large, rested on the foundation of the First Amendment.
Right. And the people who were moving the First Amendment to this position where content neutrality is understood to be the central core value of the First Amendment were the liberals. And now for the liberals to say, well, no, we don't want content neutrality. We want
to be able to decide what's acceptable speech and what's not.
Right.
And that's Orwell and that's Robespierre. I mean, we're back at the French Reign of Terror when the leftist liberals said, now we're in charge. Now we're going to decide what can be said and what can't be said. And the guillotine comes down.
And on the Supreme Court right now, there is pretty widespread support, but for the notion of content neutrality. And there's nobody up there arguing that we ought not to be content neutral. And of course, we look at the Supreme Court as being the home of the conservatives these days. So again, everything is flipped.
Yeah.
That was the liberal position 50 years ago, and now it's the conservative.
It's fascinating academically to people like us, but as August 12th shows, there's some very real, tragic outcomes of this, for lack of a better word, political conversation that's taking place. Because we're seeing, and I tried to have this conversation the other day on Facebook, and it just blew up in my face, but we're seeing more and more violence in this political conversation. And not just more and more violence, we're seeing more violence being accepted by both sides, as a necessity. Like, well, we have to be violent now. I've got to punch the Nazi. And if I don't, I'm not being true to my own principles.
And I had this discussion in one of the meetings after July 8th, where I sort of have this this view of the civil rights movement and nonviolence and so on that doesn't seem to be accepted by an awful lot of people who are sort of out in the streets right now. Where part of the idea of the nonviolent movement, as was demonstrated on March 8th on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965, is that you literally march into a fight knowing you will get beaten. And part of what's going on is you accept that beating as part of how you demonstrate the moral bankruptcy of the other side. You take on the mantle of nonviolence and everything else.
And your moral superiority of your cause.
And that's right.
Yeah.
And so I was talking about the difference between that and the notion, of course, in July 8th, the only issue was sort of the, getting in the face of police officers and yelling curse words at them and so on, which didn't really seem like coming out of a spirit of Martin Luther King and love and all this kind of stuff. And just the response was, well, I'm saying all these curse words at the police out of a spirit of love for my people.
Yeah. Well, there's a long list of excuses.
Yeah.
But the violent dog is wagging its own tail. Yeah. I mean, it's a circular argument. I must be violent. They are making me violent. The Nazi makes me violent. So it removes all agency. It removes responsibility. The police should look the other way. They shouldn't enforce assault laws because I'm punching a bad person. So I should be allowed to.
Except when the Nazi comes and punches me.
Then you need to enforce the assault laws because I'm the good person. Yeah.
And I don't know.
This is not a conversation about whether Nazism is bad.
Right.
We're past that. It's bad. But it's how do you respond to the hateful speech? How do you respond to, in the public square, to the really hateful ideologies? And I'm troubled by the left's extent, and I call it the radical left because I think of you as the left. You know, you still believe in democracy. You still believe in nonviolence. As a reaction to this, the radical left doesn't believe in democracy, doesn't believe in nonviolence. They came that day. Antifa came to the streets of Charlottesville that day with plenty of weapons. It's documented. It's on the videos. Coolers full of things to throw, their own tear gas, their own sticks. As far as we know, they did not bring guns. So, you know, props to them for that at least. But, yeah. So what happens next? What do we make of all this?
Well, in terms of Tim's report, I mean, my comment out of it all was that no matter who you believe, no matter whether you believe all of the stuff that's so damning about Chief Thomas, or whether you believe that was all just sort of a witch hunt and politically motivated and we shouldn't pay any attention, clearly there are major management challenges in the Charlottesville Police Department. And
you got a lot of officers who are not happy.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of them will be very mad at me for saying that, and others will be saying, you're darn right.
Yeah.
But it's not a happy place. And that's something that's got to get fixed.
And
Whether it gets fixed by Al Thomas or whether it gets fixed by firing Al Thomas and bringing in somebody else, or as some of my Facebook friends, it's interesting. I've got people on the left who one moment will say, fire them all. Every officer ought to, every like captain, lieutenant on up ought to go. And then the next day or so, they'll come back and say, you can't do that because you blame the black guy.
Yeah, you're just throwing the black guy under the bus.
Right.
And after a Nazi rally that was all about race, the response of the city can't be to fire the black man who's the chief of police. Yeah. No matter how much evidence may exist about his incompetence, malfeasance, whatever words you want to use. You can read your report for yourself, do your own homework. But that is certainly an argument that is out there in Charlottesville today.
And, one of the things that somebody needs to get a handle on, and let me say this, it's important for the city council and it's important for Maurice Jones, who ultimately hires, Maurice Jones doesn't hire and fire anybody in the police department except the police chief.
Yeah. It's his department to run, his or her department to run.
If Al Thomas thinks that his captains need to get fired or whatever, that's his decision. It's not Maurice Jones's. Maurice Jones needs to make a decision, and he should make it quickly, and it doesn't have to be on 100% certain evidence. But he has to make a decision and implement it and move forward with it and do so promptly and try to get some sense of order and confidence back into the department.
Can I go out on a limb here and ask you what you would do if you were Maurice Jones right now?
Well, if the investigation that Tim Heaphy has done, obviously I would not just take Tim Heaphy's word for it, but I would look at all of the facts that he's got, and I would say to Al Thomas, basically, give me your defense. What's your answer? But to me, there are a couple of things that happened that are really important. One is this notion that Tim documents about suggesting that Al Thomas has basically obstructed the investigation. The second is that there are rampant examples of, for example, he was designated the guy in charge, and he doesn't go to the planning meetings. Now, you don't have to go to every meeting, but you ought to go to the most important ones, it seems to me. And so some of that needs to get figured out. What was actually going on there? The one thing we know fairly well is that Thomas never really perceived this as what I call the hair on fire moment, where everybody needed to be saying, good Lord, this is going to be awful. We've got to do all, because the report, the affidavit that he wound up doing for the federal court, in my view, was really lukewarm. It could have been very intense about, here are the problems we've got. Here is how, we have no ability to keep people separated. And it was...
We don't have the proper equipment for riot gear. We don't have the ability to really police the intersections. And on and on and on.
And there's simply not enough room.
Right.
If you figure that you ought to be able to separate the two forces by about the distance that you can throw a water bottle, and that's a rough, 20 yards, 25 yards. If you can't get 25 yards of separation, you don't have anything approaching safe. Things didn't go badly on July 8th, but they certainly could have. Things were so packed in that day. And we saw on August 12th what could go wrong. And again, no separation. And so if he had written an affidavit to the federal court that had said, these are real problems, that might have made a difference. I just overall have a sense that Al Thomas didn't perceive this as being a big deal. He saw it as being just another,
It was a Wurtland Street block party.
It's a Wurtland Street block party.
Yeah.
And so
maybe a bunch of rowdy college students. That's what we're looking at.
And clearly, one of my big concerns about this whole thing, whether it's from the city council, whether it's from the lawyers who were involved, Al Thomas, whoever, was that they were looking at this as just another First Amendment problem, as it's going to be a demonstration and people are going to have signs and megaphones. They were not prepared, either physically or emotionally, for the fact that both sides were coming ready for a fight.
And they're using that as an excuse, Bob. That's the argument that Bob Fenwick is making. Because we were so unprepared, because this was so unprecedented, therefore, of course we were unprepared. And you can't criticize us for being unprepared because no one foresaw this kind of violence as taking place, even though there were plenty of warnings that it was going to be violent. We talked on this program for months that August 12th was going to be violent. Everybody knew it was going to be violent.
And there are, in fact, plenty of precedents for it being violent. I mean, just doing the research that I was doing to help out the city in July, I can find you scads of cases where KKK protests have gotten violent. I mean, one of the great cases, I can't remember, is a Forsyth County case, went up to the U.S. Supreme Court the U.S. Supreme Court, where they had like 40,000 protesters for like 40 KKK members. This is the kind of case that becomes famous for the discussion of the so-called heckler's veto and how we can't allow a heckler's veto. But the underlying fact pattern is violence. Expect it. Prepare for it. And we didn't.
Lloyd Snook is a Charlottesville attorney. Lloyd, we've gone over, but I really appreciate you making some time for us today. I really do appreciate it. And thanks for all you do.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.